Welcome to Inside Politics. I'm Chris Varcoe, the Calgary Herald, joined by Braid. Don, we've had a few days off, but we're back from holidays and we're in the midst of a by-election. The voters in Calgary Foothills will be going to the polls for the third time in the last year to replace Jim Prentice. We've seen some interesting developments, I guess, in terms of the nomination battles between all of the major parties. What's at stake for them all?
Well, a lot. The public doesn't really care. This is a meaningless by-election as far as the government goes in terms of its status and everything. But symbolically, it's huge because if Wildrose wins, they show they can win a seat in the big cities. They don't have a single seat in Edmonton or Calgary.
Right.
They have momentum. It'll help them with fundraising. It'll help them with morale, all sorts of things. If the NDP wins, well, it shows they really do have a foothold in Calgary, that they really are solid here. They're not just one night's uproar over the progressive Conservatives. So it is important, although not in a government sense, but certainly in a political sense, yes.
Interesting that we saw in the past week only 80 voters show up for the NDP nomination battle, which saw former MLA Bob Hawksworth win the nomination. Yet, a few days later, we see almost 800 people show up for the Wildrose nomination battle. Is that an indicator of strength between these two parties?
I don't think there's any question that the Wildrose can turn out more organizational strength of the typical traditional kind. But at that same meeting, there were a lot of New Democrats who came from other parts of the city who were not able to vote. And that's what we saw last time. A lot of people piled onto other ridings to help. There's a lot of enthusiasm out there among young and New Democrats. So I think they will be organizationally rather better off than that seemed to make them look.
Later in the week, we saw the Environment Minister, Shannon Phillips, roll out the government's new climate change panel. 5 members, some from industry, some from the environmental community. But yet we saw the government has not yet established emissions targets that they want to take to the international climate change talks in Paris. What is the significance of the announcement, and what did you make of it today?
Well, they're pretty honest about it. They say we've got to have something in our pocket before we go to Paris, or we'll look like idiots. And Notley has said she wants people to talk to her when she's there. So I think the initial part of this is going to be some window dressing involved there. I find it kind of amusing that the progressive Conservatives are complaining about them not getting this done in 3 months when they had, 43 years to do it. So the first part will be some kind of framework, and then we'll see targets and stuff like that afterwards. But I don't think we should assume from the fact that they're not taking real solid stuff to Paris that they're not really serious about this, because they are.
And I think we all know that all eyes, particularly from the oil sands community, from the energy community, from the environmental community, are on what this government's going to do with this file.
Absolutely. I think what we'll see in the next 6 months is not much happening with royalties. They're not going to do anything on royalties. It would be insanity. But they will press ahead with the climate change, and that will mean rules, regulations, possible cost increases, tax increases in the larger economy, because they can't land it all on the oil industry. That's what Tim McMillan from CAP was saying, that this is everybody's responsibility.
Finally, we saw yet another round of the fight between the provincial NDP and the federal Conservative government. Stephen Harper was campaigning up in Edmonton. He took a few shots at the Notley government, again, has been calling it a disaster, attacking their tax policy. We saw Joe Ceci, the finance minister, come back and sort of return the fire and say, you guys have run 8 consecutive deficits in a row in Ottawa. You've racked up $150 billion in debt, and you've got the worst job creation record since the Second World War. It seems like it's getting nasty here.
Well, the provincial NDP really wanted to stay out of it because it's an awkward situation for them. Because, the Linda McQuaig thing, what do they say about that? If they argue with her, then Harper would say, look, they agree with us. It's complicated. So they wanted to stay out, but they finally had to roll out Joe to say something, because Harper keeps saying these people are a disaster. Now, personally, I think maybe it's going to achieve something for him, the Prime Minister, on the national level, but it doesn't help Alberta to have the Prime Minister, who's from here, saying that the government of this province is a disaster. We all know about the concerns about investment and all the rest of it. I don't think he's helping. I'm not sure it'll help him here that much, but that's probably not his goal.
Far cry from the days of Ralph Klein, the Conservative Premier, attacking and picking fights with the Liberal government in Ottawa, but that's for another day. Let's talk about our winners and losers of the past week in politics here. Who's your winner? Who's had a good week?
I liked what Sarah Hoffman, the health minister, did by canceling the contract for massive privatization of lab testing in Edmonton in the north. There was going to be something like, if this had gone through, 80% of all tests were going to be in private hands, private responsibility, and the rest of the province about 30%. But it was going to come here too. That's what the PCs had in mind. It was a big contract, $3 billion. There wasn't much public insight into it. People didn't seem to know what was going on. On the balance, even though it's complicated, there may be a lawsuit. I think she did the right thing to make it clear that the NDP isn't going to go too far with privatization.
My winner of the week is Greg Clark, the Alberta Party leader. When you're in a party of one and you're struggling with other opposition parties to get media attention, it can often be a difficult chore, but he in the past few days has scored a couple of big wins. Number one is he highlighted the issue of some homes, abandoned homes, or homes that have been bought out rather, by the province in the city of Calgary and down in High River, and the government's sort of very vague plans of demolishing them without really giving any kind of explanation to the public of what they're doing, what's going to happen with these homes, how much has been spent on them. I just think there's a lot of questions to be answered. He highlighted them. The government has yet to provide an answer, so good for him for doing that. He also brought up some issues of power prices and on the wholesale market, how they spiked back in May and June. The energy minister said she's going to investigate and have a review, so he got some action, so good for him. Don, what about your losers of the week?
There's a general theme we're kind of seeing that the NDP isn't all that. They're connected. They know what's going on here, but they're really not connected with some of the worst things that have happened in this city. I mean, that's flood stuff, and they're not all that well briefed sometimes on that. But my case is Darren Byelection, the Municipal Affairs Minister, refusing to provide any funding at all, any extra funding for disaster for last September's Snowmageddon, which we know was a huge disaster. I mean, it sounds kind of silly to say, yeah, we had a snowstorm, a bunch of branches fell down, some trees fell down, but this was citywide, massive, expensive thing,
and they're going to $20 million of damage. Yeah.
Right, they're not going to do anything at all, and I think you had to be here really but you also have to have some imagination if you're a politician. That was an emotional event in this city, and I was kind of shocked that they just sort of brushed it off like that.
Well, my loser of the week is the Human Services Department, Alberta Human Services. We want to talk about a real tragedy. We saw it really highlighted this week by the youth advocate Del Graff, who went through the case of a 8-year-old girl who was in foster care. She died under sort of mysterious circumstances by getting too much medication, sleeping medication. It's a very sad tale, but in the midst of that review, two things were really revealed. Number one is that the youth advocate still cannot name the names of children who die in care, leaving them anonymous. I thought we'd resolve this under the Conservatives months ago. And separately is he really highlighted the lack of follow-up on his calls for more training for frontline services. I don't understand why this department continues to have these problems. The Minister Sabir has got to get his hands around it, and he's got to fix this problem, and he's got to fix it fast. Anyways, so we'll leave it on that note. Thanks, Don, for joining us today.